The morning he told me I had become unbearable to look upon, I understood that 25 years of marriage could dissolve in the space of a single sentence. I had given Victor Ashworth my youth, my devotion, and the quiet architecture of a life that allowed his genius to flourish, and in return, he offered me the back of his hand as he gestured toward the door of the home I had made beautiful for him. My name is Eleanor Ashworth, and I was 47 years old when my husband, the celebrated portrait painter of London society, informed me that my face had become a ruin he could no longer endure. He said it without cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it worse. He said it as though he were observing the weather or remarking upon the quality of light through the studio windows. He said it as though I were not standing before him with my hands still damp from arranging the flowers he liked to see on his breakfast table. I remember the precise quality of that February morning. The fog pressed against the windows of our Mayfair townhouse like a living thing, gray and patient, and utterly indifferent to the dissolution occurring within those walls. I had risen early, as I always did, to ensure the household ran with the invisible efficiency that Victor had come to expect without ever acknowledging. The fires were lit in every room he might enter. His coffee was prepared exactly as he preferred it. His correspondence was sorted and waiting beside his plate. I had spent 25 years perfecting the machinery of his comfort, and I had become so skilled at it that he no longer noticed the machine at all. Victor stood before the great mirror in his studio, the one I had brought to our marriage as part of my modest dowry. It was an extraordinary piece, framed in dark Venetian glass that seemed to hold light within its depths rather than merely reflecting it. My grandmother had acquired it during her travels in Italy, and family legend held that it had once belonged to an alchemist who sought the secret of eternal youth. I had always thought it a romantic fancy, the sort of story families tell to make their heirlooms seem more significant than they are. That morning, as Victor stood before it adjusting his cravat, I could not have imagined how significant that mirror would become. He did not turn to face me when he spoke. He addressed my reflection, or perhaps he addressed only his own, finding it easier to deliver his verdict to the glass than to the woman herself. "Eleanor," he said, "I have been patient. I have tried to find in your face some remnant of what once inspired me, but the truth is unavoidable. You have become a relic of a time that no longer serves my art or my spirit. I require beauty around me. I require youth. I require the vitality that fuels creation. And you, my dear, have none of these things left to offer." I stood very still. I had learned over the years that stillness was my only armor against his pronouncements. If I wept, he would find my tears theatrical and distasteful. If I argued, he would grow cold and dismissive. If I pleaded, he would look upon me with that particular expression of disgust he reserved for weakness of any kind. So I stood still and let his words wash over me like the tide over a stone that has long since forgotten how to feel the water. He continued speaking, still addressing the mirror. He told me about Lilith. He told me about her copper hair and her porcelain skin and her eyes that held the fire of ambition and youth. He told me she had come to his studio seeking work as a model, and that the moment he saw her, he understood what his art had been missing all these years. He told me she was 22 years old and that her beauty was a gift he intended to unwrap slowly, savoring each revelation. I listened to every word. I memorized them, though I wished I could do otherwise. I memorized the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, Lilith, as though the very syllables were a caress. I memorized the way his eyes, still fixed on his own reflection, seemed to brighten with an animation I had not seen in them for years, perhaps decades. I memorized the way his hands moved as he described her, those elegant painter's hands that had once touched my face with something I believed was tenderness. I had met her once, Lilith. 2 weeks earlier, at a gathering Victor had insisted I attend, though he had made clear that my presence was a formality, a necessary prop to maintain appearances while he moved through the room with his new muse on his arm. She had looked at me with those remarkable eyes and smiled, And in that smile I had seen everything I needed to understand. She did not see me as a rival. She did not see me as an obstacle. She did not see me at all, really, except as a minor inconvenience that would soon be swept aside. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps that is exactly what I had become. He told me he wanted a divorce. In those days, divorce was a scandal that could destroy a woman utterly. It marked her as damaged goods, as someone who had failed at the one task society demanded of her. A divorced woman was not received in polite company. She was whispered about at tea parties and excluded from invitation lists. She was pitied by those who wished to appear charitable and condemned by those who did not bother with pretense. Victor knew this. He knew exactly what he was asking me to accept. But he had calculated, correctly, that I had no power to refuse him. The house was his. The money was his. The paintings that hung in galleries across Europe, paintings that I had helped him create by managing every domestic detail so that he could focus solely on his work, those paintings bore his signature alone. I had no profession, no income, no family left to shelter me. My parents had died years ago, and I had no siblings. I had poured everything I was into being Victor Ashworth's wife, and now that vessel was being discarded. He gave me 1 week to arrange my departure. I spent that week moving through the house like a ghost, touching the objects I would never see again. The porcelain shepherdess on the mantel that I had found at a little shop in Paris during our honeymoon. The velvet chair by the window where I had sat countless evenings, reading while Victor painted in his studio above. The garden I had planted and tended for 2 decades, watching it grow from bare earth into a small Eden of roses and lavender and climbing jasmine. I took very little with me when I left, a few dresses, some books, my grandmother's mirror I left behind, partly because it was too large to transport, and partly because I could not bear to look at my own reflection any longer. If my face had become so repulsive that it could drive away the man who had once written sonnets to my eyes, then I had no wish to see it. My former lady's maid, Agnes, had married a shopkeeper some years earlier and lived now in modest but respectable lodgings in Bloomsbury. She had written to me faithfully over the years, always remembering my birthday, always asking after my health, always maintaining the connection that the difference in our stations should have dissolved long ago. When she learned of my circumstances, she offered me a room in her home without hesitation, without conditions, without a single word of reproach for the woman who had once been her employer and was now reduced to charity. Her husband, Mr. William Porter, was a kind man with a round face and gentle eyes who sold hardware and household goods from a shop on the ground floor of their building. He welcomed me into their home with the same uncomplicated warmth his wife had shown, asking no questions about my past, making no judgments about my present. He simply pulled out a chair at their small dining table and poured me a cup of tea and told me that any friend of Agnes was welcome under his roof for as long as she needed to stay. The room they gave me was small and simply furnished, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over a cramped courtyard where the neighbors hung their washing and children played in the narrow strip of grimy sunlight that reached between the buildings. It smelled of coal smoke and cabbage and the particular must of old fabric that accumulates in rooms that never quite get enough air. It was nothing like the airy, elegant chambers I had inhabited in Mayfair. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen, because it was mine, or at least it was offered to me freely, without the weight of obligation or the shadow of displeasure. No one would come to this room and tell me I was unbearable. No one would stand in that doorway and catalogue my failures as a wife, as a woman, as a human being. In that small, shabby room with its narrow bed and its view of hanging laundry, I could simply exist without apology. The first night in that little room, I wept. I wept for hours, silently, my face pressed into the unfamiliar pillow so that Agnes and her husband would not hear. I wept for the girl I had been when I married Victor, so full of hope and love and certainty that I had found my place in the world. I wept for the years I had given him, the youth I had sacrificed on the altar of his genius, I wept for the woman I had become, invisible and unnecessary, a worn coin that had passed through too many hands to hold any value. But when morning came, I found that I had no more tears left. The well had run dry, and in its place was something I had not expected. Not anger, not despair, but a strange, cool emptiness that felt almost like peace. Perhaps it was exhaustion, masquerading as acceptance. Perhaps it was the numbness that comes after prolonged suffering, the soul's way of protecting itself from further damage. Or perhaps it was the first stirring of something that had been buried for so long I had forgotten it existed. The quiet, stubborn determination to survive. I rose and washed my face in the cold water from the basin, watching in the small mirror above the washstand as the puffiness from my tears slowly subsided. My face looked old in that gray morning light, older than my 47 years, lined with the evidence of sleepless nights and suppressed grief. But it was still my face, still the face of Eleanor Ashworth, or whoever I would become now that I was no longer defined by my marriage. I dressed in one of my plain gray dresses, the kind of dress that Victor had always dismissed as dowdy, but that I found comfortable and practical. I pinned up my hair without the elaborate styling that had been expected of me in Mayfair. I looked at myself one last time in that small mirror and saw a woman stripped of pretense, stripped of performance, stripped of everything except the essential truth of her own existence. I went downstairs to take breakfast with Agnes. She looked at me with worried eyes, clearly expecting to find me devastated. Perhaps hoping I would not be so devastated that she would have to spend the day coaxing me to eat and reassuring me that life would go on. But I smiled at her, a small smile, but a real one, and I asked her to pass the marmalade. The look of relief on her face was almost comical, almost, but not quite, because beneath the relief I saw something else, respect. She had expected me to be broken, and instead she found me sitting at her breakfast table, asking for marmalade. It was such a small act of survival, but small acts are often the most significant. I did not know it then, but my life was about to begin again. The news of my divorce spread through London society like fire through dry kindling. I had expected this. What I had not expected was the letter that arrived 3 weeks after I left Mayfair, delivered by a messenger in Victor's livery. The letter was from Victor himself, but it bore none of his usual elegant penmanship. The words sprawled across the page in jagged, desperate strokes, as though written by a man whose hands would not stop shaking. Eleanor, the letter read. Something has happened. Something I cannot explain. You must come at once. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I am begging you. I am begging. I read the letter twice, then set it aside and poured myself another cup of tea. Agnes watched me with undisguised curiosity, but I offered no explanation. I simply sat in the morning light of her little parlor and considered my options. I could ignore him. After everything he had done, after the cruelty and the abandonment, I owed him nothing. He had cast me out like refuse, and now he expected me to come running at his summons? The audacity of it should have made me laugh. But there was something in those desperate, shaking words that caught at something in my chest. Not love, certainly. That had been dying for years before he finally killed it. But perhaps curiosity. Perhaps the remnants of the concern one feels for any creature in distress, even a creature that has caused one great harm. Or perhaps, and this is what I did not wish to admit even to myself, perhaps some small, petty part of me wanted to see what had brought the great Victor Ashworth to his knees. I went to him that afternoon. The house looked the same from the outside. The same elegant facade, the same polished brass knocker, the same bay windows reflecting the gray London sky. But when the butler opened the door, I saw immediately that something was terribly wrong. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes darted nervously as though afraid of what might emerge from the shadows. He led me to Victor's studio without a word. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I climbed, each step awakening memories I would rather have left dormant. How many times had I ascended these stairs with a cup of tea for Victor, or a message from a caller he did not wish to see, or simply the quiet hope that today might be different, that today he might look up from his canvas and smile at me the way he used to, in those early years when I still believed our love was real? The banister was smooth beneath my palm, worn by years of hands, my hands among them, and I felt a sharp pang of grief for the woman who had climbed these stairs, believing she mattered to someone. I had been in that room thousands of times over the course of my marriage. I knew every corner of it, every canvas stacked against the wall, every jar of pigment on the work table, every brush worn soft with use. I knew the smell of it, oil paint and turpentine, and the particular must of old fabric from the drapes that Victor refused to replace because he liked the way the light filtered through their faded damask. I knew the way the floorboards creaked in the northeast corner, where water had once leaked through the roof during a particularly violent storm. I knew which chair was reserved for models and which was forbidden to anyone but Victor himself. I knew the precise angle at which the afternoon light fell across the great Venetian mirror, transforming it into a pool of liquid gold. But the room I entered that day was different. The mirrors were covered. Every reflective surface in the studio, from the great Venetian glass to the small hand mirror on the dressing table, had been draped in black cloth. The windows were shuttered, and the only light came from candles that flickered and danced, casting strange shadows on the walls. And in the center of the room, huddled in a chair like a broken puppet, was Victor. I did not recognize him at first. The man before me was ancient, his skin hanging in loose folds from a skull that seemed too prominent beneath its papery covering. His hair, which had been dark and thick with only the dignified touch of silver at the temples, was now white as snow and thin as cobwebs. His hands, those beautiful hands that had created masterpieces, were gnarled and spotted with age, trembling where they gripped the arms of the chair. He looked up at me with eyes that had grown rheumy and dim, and his lips, cracked and pale, formed my name. Eleanor. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This could not be Victor. Victor was 52 years old, vital and handsome and vain about both. This creature before me looked 90 if he looked a day, a withered husk of a man waiting for death to complete its claim. But those eyes, even dimmed and clouded as they were, I knew those eyes. I had looked into them on my wedding day and seen what I believed was love. I had looked into them for 25 years and watched that love curdle into indifference and finally into contempt. I knew those eyes, and they were Victor's eyes, and somehow, impossibly, this ancient ruin was my husband. "What happened to you?" I whispered. He laughed, a terrible sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. "What happened?" "You happened, Eleanor. Or perhaps I happened to myself. Perhaps my sins have finally found their accounting." I moved closer despite myself, drawn by the horror of his transformation. He flinched back from me as though afraid I might touch him. "The morning after you left," he said, his voice cracking and weak. I went to the mirror. Our mirror, your grandmother's mirror. I wanted to see myself, to remind myself of what I was, what I had achieved. I wanted to look upon my own face and feel satisfaction at the choice I had made. But when I looked into that glass, I did not see myself. I saw this thing I have become. He raised one trembling hand to his own face, and I saw tears leak from the corners of his clouded eyes. I thought at first it was some trick of the light, some distortion of the glass. But then I looked at my hands, and they were the hands of an old man. I called for my valet, and when he saw me, he screamed. He actually screamed, "Eleanor." And then he ran. "The servants," I said slowly, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "They have not all left? Some stayed, the ones who have been with me for years. They do not understand what has happened, but they are loyal. Or perhaps they are simply too frightened to leave. I have had doctors come. 3 of them now. They examined me, took samples of my blood, peered into my eyes and down my throat. None of them can explain it. None of them can help me. They look at me like I am some specimen, some aberration of nature. One of them suggested I had simply been ill for months without knowing it, that my mind had created a false memory of my former appearance to protect me from the truth of my decline, as though I would not know my own face. His voice broke, and he began to weep in earnest, great racking sobs that shook his frail frame. I should have felt satisfaction. Is that not what the stories tell us? That the wicked are punished and the righteous vindicated? I had been cast aside, humiliated, stripped of everything I had built over a quarter-century of marriage, and now my tormentor sat before me, destroyed by some force I could not name. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt nothing but a vast and terrible pity. I did not return to Victor that day. I left him weeping in his darkened studio, surrounded by the covered mirrors and the flickering candles, and I walked back to Bloomsbury in a daze. Agnes met me at the door, full of questions, but I could not speak. I went to my little room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and tried to make sense of what I had witnessed. It was impossible, of course. People do not age 50 years in a single night. The body does not work that way. There must be some rational explanation, some medical condition that could account for Victor's transformation. Perhaps the doctors were right and he had been declining for months without anyone noticing. Perhaps his mind had fractured under the strain of some hidden illness, creating false memories to cover the gradual decay. But I had seen him the morning I left Mayfair. I had seen him standing before that mirror, adjusting his cravat, his face smooth and handsome and cruel. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks was not enough time for a man to transform so completely, unless something supernatural had occurred. I turned the thought over in my mind, examining it from every angle. I was not a superstitious woman. I had been raised in the Church of England and had maintained a respectable, if somewhat lukewarm, faith throughout my life. I did not believe in ghosts or curses or the kind of penny dreadful nonsense that entertained serving girls on their half-days off. But I could not deny what I had seen with my own eyes. And I could not forget the legend of my grandmother's mirror, the mirror that had once belonged to a Venetian alchemist who sought eternal youth. I dreamed that night of mirrors, endless mirrors, reflecting not my face but Victor's, hundreds of Victors aging and withering and crumbling to dust while I walked among them, untouched, watching his decay repeat itself infinitely in every direction. I woke with the taste of copper on my tongue and a certainty that I had not yet discovered the truth of what had happened in that studio. The next morning, I received another visitor. He arrived just as Agnes and I were finishing breakfast, a tall man in a well-cut but sober coat, carrying a doctor's bag and an air of quiet competence. Agnes showed him into the parlor, and I went to meet him with curiosity and a touch of wariness. "I am Dr. Thomas Hale," he said, bowing slightly. "Forgive my intrusion, Mrs. Ashworth. I was asked to examine your husband yesterday, and I have come to speak with you about what I observed." I recognized him then, though it took me a moment to place where I had seen him before. A charity dinner, 6 or 7 years ago. Victor had been forced to attend by some social obligation, and I had spent most of the evening seated beside a quietly attentive man who had asked me thoughtful questions and actually listened to my answers. It had been such a novelty that I remembered it still. "Dr. Hale," I said, "I remember you. You told me about your work at the Children's Hospital in Whitechapel." His face softened with surprise. "You remember that? It was so long ago." "I remember kindness," I said simply. It was rare enough in my experience that it made an impression. Something passed across his features, too quick for me to name. He gestured to the chairs by the window. "May I sit? I have much to tell you, and some of it may be difficult to hear." We sat facing each other in the pale morning light. Agnes brought tea, and I poured it with hands that were steadier than I expected, given the circumstances. Dr. Hale began speaking, and as he spoke, I understood that he was not an ordinary physician. His medical training was conventional enough, but his interests had led him into stranger territories, the borderlands where science met superstition, where rationality confronted phenomena it could not explain. "I have made a study of cases like your husband's," he said carefully. "Cases where the physical deterioration of the body seems to follow laws that medicine cannot account for. They are rare, but they exist. I have documented 7 in my career, and they all share certain common elements." "What elements?" I asked. He hesitated, as though choosing his words with great care. In each case, there was a precipitating event, a betrayal usually, a cruel act that damaged someone who had loved the afflicted person deeply. And in each case, there was an object, a mirror, a portrait, a piece of jewelry, something old, something with a history that stretched back further than living memory. "My grandmother's mirror," I said. He nodded slowly. "I examined it yesterday. There are markings on the frame, very faint, almost invisible unless you know what to look for. They are alchemical symbols, Mrs. Ashworth. The mirror was made by someone who understood things that we have forgotten or dismissed as fantasy." "And these symbols," I said, my voice steady though my heart was racing, "what do they do?" Dr. Hale set down his teacup and leaned forward. "Are you certain you want to know? Once I tell you, you cannot unknow it." I met his eyes. They were gray, I noticed, the gray of winter seas, and full of an intelligence that was both compassionate and unflinching. He did not look at me as Victor had always looked at me, seeing only surface and finding it wanting. He looked at me as though he was trying to see who I truly was beneath the careful armor I had built over years of quiet suffering. "Tell me," I said. "The mirror," he explained, "was created to reveal truth. Its maker believed that beauty was not merely a matter of physical appearance, but a reflection of the soul. He crafted the glass to show not what a person looked like, but what they truly were inside. For most people, the difference is minimal. We are none of us angels, but most of us are not monsters either. The glass shows us a face somewhat aged beyond our years, perhaps, marked by our small cruelties and compromises, but recognizable, bearable. But for someone like Victor, someone whose soul had been corroded by years of taking and never giving, of using others and discarding them when their usefulness was exhausted, for someone who had drained the light from another person day by day, year by year, feeding on their devotion while offering nothing in return. For such a person, Dr. Hale said quietly, the mirror shows the truth, and the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The body follows where the soul leads. The mask falls away, and what remains is what was always there beneath the surface. I sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing this. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I first saw Victor in his studio. "Is there a cure?" Dr. Hale's expression shifted, becoming something more complex. "There is a reversal. The alchemist who created the mirror understood that truth alone is not enough. He built into the glass a possibility of redemption, but it requires something that your husband may not be capable of giving. What does it require?" "Genuine remorse," he said. "Not regret for consequences, not sorrow for what he has lost, but true understanding of the harm he has caused and true desire to make amends. The mirror must see in him a changed soul before it will restore his former appearance." I almost laughed. Victor, feel genuine remorse? Victor, who had never in his life admitted fault for anything. Victor, who believed that his genius entitled him to take whatever he wanted from the world without consideration for the cost to others. "Then he will die like this," I said. "He is not capable of what you describe." Dr. Hale nodded slowly. "That is what I feared. I examined him thoroughly yesterday, Mrs. Ashworth. His body is that of a man in his final years. His heart is weakening. His lungs are failing. Without intervention, I give him 3 months at most, perhaps less. I should have felt triumph at these words. The man who had thrown me away was now himself being thrown away by his own body, discarded as worthless as he had discarded me. Poetic justice, the morality tales would call it. The wicked punished by divine providence. But as I sat in that small parlor with Dr. Hale's gentle gray eyes upon me, I found that I could not rejoice in Victor's destruction. Whatever he had done to me, whatever cruelties he had inflicted, he was still a human being. He was still suffering. And I had learned, over 25 years of marriage, that suffering does not become noble simply because it is deserved. "What about her?" I asked. "The young woman, Lilith. What has become of her?" Dr. Hale's expression darkened. "She fled the house the night of his transformation. The servants told me she screamed when she saw him and ran without even collecting her belongings. No one knows where she has gone." Of course, I thought. Of course she ran. She had been drawn to Victor's success, his reputation, his power. She had seen in him a stepping stone to her own ambitions. What use had she for a withered old man with nothing left to offer but the shell of a ruined life? I thought of how Victor must have felt watching her flee. He had sacrificed his marriage, destroyed a woman who had loved him faithfully for decades, all for the chance to possess Lilith's youth and beauty. And now youth and beauty had abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. Dr. Hale visited me again the following day, and the day after that. He said he wished to keep me informed of Victor's condition, but I sensed there was more to his visits than medical duty. He brought me books on subjects that interested him, philosophy and natural science and the poetry of Shelley and Keats. He brought volumes on botany because I had mentioned once in passing that I had always wanted to learn the proper names of the flowers in my garden. He brought a collection of essays on art history because he had noticed the way my eyes lingered on the prints that hung in Agnes's modest parlor. He asked me about my own thoughts and listened carefully to my answers. He leaned forward when I spoke, as though my words contained secrets he was eager to understand. He did not interrupt or correct or redirect the conversation toward himself. He simply listened, with those gray eyes fixed on my face, and when I fell silent, he would ask a question that proved he had been paying attention, that proved he had heard not only what I said, but what I meant. It was such a strange sensation being heard. I had forgotten what it felt like. Victor had not truly listened to me in years, had not asked my opinion on anything that mattered, had not looked at me with the expectation that I might have something worthwhile to contribute. I had become accustomed to speaking into the void, to offering my thoughts and watching them disappear without trace. Now here was this man, this quiet doctor with his gentle manner and his remarkable memory, who seemed to find value in everything I said. He noticed the small drawings I had begun making in a sketchbook Agnes had given me. She had found it at a second-hand stall, slightly water-damaged but still usable, and had pressed it into my hands with a smile and an instruction to keep myself busy. I had begun filling it with sketches of the view from my window, of the neighbors coming and going, of the way the light fell across Agnes's parlor in the late afternoon. They were nothing special, just the idle observations of a woman with too much time and too many thoughts, but Thomas examined them with genuine interest. "You have a real eye for composition," he said, turning the pages carefully. "The way you have captured the movement here, the sense of life in these figures, it is quite remarkable." I laughed, dismissing the compliment. "I am no artist. I am simply amusing myself." He looked up at me, his expression serious. "Art does not require genius, Mrs. Ashworth. It requires only the willingness to see and the courage to put that seeing onto paper. You have both. Whether you choose to call yourself an artist is your own affair, but the evidence is here in my hands." I found myself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation I had not felt in years. It confused me at first. I was a woman whose husband lay dying under supernatural judgment, a woman whose life had been torn apart just weeks before. I had no business feeling this flutter of warmth when Dr. Hale's card arrived with the Morning Post. I had no business noticing the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, or the careful gentleness with which he handled the fragile objects in Agnes's parlor. But I noticed nonetheless. One afternoon, about a month after my first visit to Victor's studio, Dr. Hale arrived with news that the young woman, Lilith, had been located. She had taken refuge with a distant relative in Hampshire and was refusing all communication with anyone connected to Victor. I should try to speak with her, I said, without thinking. She may know something about what happened that night, something that could help. Dr. Hale looked at me with an expression I could not quite interpret. There was surprise in it, certainly, but also something deeper, something that looked almost like admiration. You would do that? After what she took from you? I considered the question carefully. I thought about Lilith's beautiful face, her copper hair, the way Victor had spoken her name with such reverence. I thought about the weeks of misery that had followed Victor's announcement, the nights I had spent weeping into Agnes's spare pillow, the moments when I had wondered if there was any point in continuing at all. Lilith had not caused my marriage to fail. That failure had been building for years, perhaps for decades. But she had been the catalyst, the excuse Victor needed to finally do what he had wanted to do for so long. And yet, what did she take from me, really? A man who no longer wanted me, a marriage that had become a prison, a life that had been slowly suffocating me for years without my fully realizing how starved for air I had become. Victor had blamed Lilith, had told himself that his new muse was the cause of his decision to cast me aside. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Victor had stopped loving me long before Lilith appeared. She was merely the excuse he had been waiting for, the beautiful justification for an ugliness that had always lived in his heart. She took nothing that was not already lost, I said finally, and she is very young. Young enough to be my daughter, had I ever been blessed with offspring. Young enough to have been dazzled by a famous man's attention without understanding what she was getting herself into, without recognizing the trap she was walking into. I do not hate her. I do not even blame her, really. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the machinery of Victor's selfishness, just as I was. Dr. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Ashworth." The words struck me with unexpected force. Remarkable. No one had called me remarkable in longer than I could remember. Victor had called me adequate, in his better moods. He had called me serviceable, useful, tolerable. He had never called me remarkable. "I am merely tired," I replied, trying to dismiss the compliment before it could take root in my heart. Tired of anger, tired of bitterness. They are exhausting emotions, and I have carried them long enough. One cannot spend one's entire life being angry without eventually becoming nothing but anger, and I refuse to let Victor turn me into that. He reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. It was improper. It was forward. It was entirely inappropriate given the circumstances, and I did not pull away. "Eleanor," he said, using my Christian name for the first time. "I must tell you something. I must be honest with you, though I fear you will think me mad." "What is it?" I asked. "I have studied the mirror extensively over the past weeks," he said. "I have read everything I can find about its creator and his work, and I believe I have discovered something important, something that explains not only what happened to Victor, but why it happened when it did." I waited, my hand still in his, my heart beating fast. "The mirror responds to truth," he said, "but it does not act alone. It requires a catalyst, a release of accumulated pain, of years of suppressed anguish, of grief that has been swallowed and silenced. The mirror absorbs this pain, stores it, and when the one who caused it finally looks into the glass with intention, with pride, with the belief that they are seeing their own triumph, the mirror shows them instead what they have made. You are saying, I said slowly, that I did this, that my pain caused Victor's transformation. Not intentionally, not consciously, but yes. The morning Victor looked into that mirror, meaning to admire himself after casting you out, the mirror had absorbed 25 years of your suffering. It had recorded every tear you swallowed, every wound you hid, every hope you watched die. And when Victor stood before it, full of satisfaction at having freed himself from you, the mirror gave him back what he had given you all those years: decay, neglect, the slow death of everything vital. I sat very still, processing this revelation. I was not innocent in Victor's destruction. I was, in some metaphysical sense I did not fully understand, its cause. My pain had been the weapon that felled him. Does this mean I can reverse it? I asked. If my pain caused it, can my forgiveness undo it? Dr. Hale shook his head. It is not that simple. The mirror responded to truth, to the reality of what you had endured. To reverse its effect would require Victor to feel genuine remorse, genuine understanding of what he did to you. Your forgiveness alone is not enough. He must earn it. And if he cannot, then he will die as he is. There is no other way. I went to see Victor the next day. Dr. Hale accompanied me, standing quietly by the door like a sentinel, ready to intervene if needed, but trusting me to navigate this confrontation on my own terms. I appreciated his presence more than I could express. The simple knowledge that I was not alone, that someone would be there to catch me if I fell. I approached the huddled figure in the chair. Victor looked even worse than he had during my last visit. His skin had taken on a grayish cast, like parchment left too long in a damp room, and his breathing was labored and wet, each inhalation a rattling struggle. His hands, those beautiful artist's hands that had created masterpieces, lay curled in his lap like dead birds. He was dying, slowly but unmistakably, consumed by the truth of his own soul. "Eleanor," he rasped when he saw me. His voice was barely more than a whisper, a dry, crackling sound that bore no resemblance to the confident tones I remembered. "You came back. I did not think you would come back. I came to talk," I said. "Nothing more." He laughed weakly, a terrible rattling sound that dissolved into a fit of coughing. "Talk. What is there to talk about? Look at me, Eleanor. Look at what I have become. I am dying, dying alone in this darkened room while the world forgets I ever existed. Lilith is gone. My friends have abandoned me. My patrons have withdrawn their commissions and asked for the return of their deposits. The gallery that was planning my retrospective has canceled the exhibition. Everything I built, everything I achieved has crumbled to dust. My legacy will be this horror, this cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms about the great artist who was struck down by some mysterious ailment." I took a breath and said what I had come to say. The words had been forming in my mind for weeks, crystallizing slowly like ice on a window pane, and now I let them fall, one by one, into the darkness between us. "Do you understand why this is happening to you, Victor?" He stared at me with his clouded eyes, and in them I saw something I had never seen before: fear. Not the momentary fear of a man facing a difficult situation, but the bone-deep terror of a creature who has finally glimpsed its own mortality and cannot look away. "Of course I understand," he said, his voice cracking. "The mirror is cursed. Some devil's magic, some trick of malevolent forces beyond human comprehension. It saw my intention to leave you and punished me for it. I am being punished, Eleanor. Punished for wanting to be happy, for wanting beauty and youth and inspiration around me instead of decay and disappointment." "No," I said quietly, and the word fell between us like a stone into still water. "The mirror does not punish. It reveals. What you see in your reflection is not a curse laid upon you by outside forces, not some cosmic retribution for your desires. It is you, Victor, the truth of who you are, who you have always been beneath the mask you showed the world." He recoiled as though I had struck him. "That is a lie. I am Victor Ashworth. I am a genius. I have created beauty that will outlive us both. I have contributed more to this world than 1,000 ordinary men. My soul is not this thing I have become. I knelt beside his chair so that our eyes were level. 25 years, I said. 25 years, I gave you everything I had. I managed your household, I protected your reputation. I entertained the patrons and soothed the critics and kept at bay all the tedious, practical matters that would have distracted you from your precious work. I loved you, Victor. I loved you with everything in me. And do you know what you gave me in return? He said nothing. His breath came in short, painful gasps. Silence, I said. Indifference. The slow, grinding certainty that I was invisible to the one person who should have seen me most clearly. You took my youth, Victor. You took my hope. You took my belief that I was worth something, that I mattered, that I was more than a servant too stupid to realize she was not being paid. And when there was nothing left to take, you threw me away like refuse. Eleanor, he whispered, I am not finished. The mirror showed you the truth because you finally looked into it, expecting to see triumph. You thought you had won. You thought that by discarding me, you had freed yourself from decay and age and the reminder of how many years you had wasted. But you were wrong. The decay was not in me, Victor. It was always in you. The mirror simply made it visible. Tears were streaming down his withered face now. I do not know how to be sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I do not know how to feel what you want me to feel. I have never felt it, Eleanor. I have never felt anything except the hunger to create, to possess, to make beautiful things that would carry my name into eternity. You speak of remorse as though it is a skill I could learn, but I have no capacity for it. I never have. I know, I said. That is why you are dying. I stood and turned away from him. I had said what I came to say. There was nothing more. But as I reached the door, his voice stopped me. One last, desperate plea. Is there nothing? No hope at all? I looked back at him over my shoulder. You asked me once what I wanted from our marriage. Do you remember? We had been married only a few months. I told you I wanted to be seen, to be truly seen by you, not as an accessory or a convenience, but as a person. You laughed. You said you saw everything, that seeing was your gift, but you never saw me, Victor, not once in 25 years. I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. If you want hope, you must find a way to see. Not yourself, not your reflection, not your art. See the people you have hurt. See the damage you have done. Feel it, truly feel it. Not because feeling might save you, but because the damage was real and the people were real and they deserved better than you gave them. That is the only path back from where you are, from. I did not expect to find Edward there, seated at the worn wooden table with a glass of whiskey in his hand and shadows under his eyes. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The kitchen was lit only by the dying embers of the cooking fire, casting his face in shades of amber and gold. He looked tired. He looked lonely. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had been carrying a burden for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. I could not sleep, I said, the words sounding foolish even as I spoke them. Nor could I, he replied. The storms always bring her back. He did not need to say who he meant. I moved to the stove and began heating milk, grateful for something to do with my hands. Behind me, I could hear him shifting in his chair, could feel his eyes on my back like a physical weight. May I ask you something, Miss Vance? He said. Of course, my lord. There was a long pause. Then he said, Do you believe in fate? I turned to face him, the question catching me off guard. Fate? The idea that certain things are meant to happen, he said, that certain people are meant to meet. That there are forces at work in this world that guide us toward our destinies, whether we understand them or not. I considered the question carefully. I believe, I said slowly, that we make choices, and that those choices shape our lives. But I also believe that sometimes the choices we make lead us exactly where we were always meant to go. He smiled then, a small, sad smile that made my heart ache. Marguerite used to say something similar. She said that the universe had a plan for all of us, and that our only job was to have the courage to follow it. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, I said. She was, he agreed. But she was also troubled. The gift that ran in her blood, the visions and the voices and the things she saw that no one else could see, they tormented her. She could never find peace, not even with me. His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw him struggling to maintain his composure. Without thinking, I crossed the room and sat down across from him, reaching out to lay my hand over his. You loved her, I said. That is clear in everything you say, everything you do. You loved her, and you tried to save her. That is not nothing. He looked at our joined hands, and I saw something shift in his expression, something that might have been gratitude, or surprise, or the beginning of something else entirely. You are very kind, Miss Vance, he said softly. Eleanor, I corrected him. Please, call me Eleanor. He raised his eyes to meet mine, and in the firelight they burned like molten gold. Eleanor, he repeated, as if tasting the name. It suits you. Strong, classical, a name for someone who endures. I did not know what to say to that. I only knew that his hand was warm beneath mine, and that the storm was raging outside, and that in this moment, in this kitchen, we were the only two people in the world. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through mine. I should not do this, he said, his voice rough. You are in my employ. It is not proper. Nothing about this situation is proper, I replied. Nothing has been proper since the moment your dogs knelt at my feet. He laughed then, a real laugh, the first I had heard from him. It transformed his face, erasing years of grief and worry, revealing the man he must have been before tragedy claimed him. No, he agreed. I suppose it has not been. We sat there in the dying firelight, hands intertwined, while the storm howled around us. We did not kiss. We did not speak of love. But something passed between us in that silence, something that felt like a promise or a prayer, or the first tentative shoots of something that had been buried too long in the frozen ground. When I finally returned to my room, the milk forgotten and cooling on the stove, I knew that everything had changed. I knew that I was no longer simply a maid in this house. I was something more, something that frightened me and thrilled me in equal measure. And I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that whatever came next, I would face it with Edward at my side. The days that followed were charged with a new electricity. We did not speak of what had happened in the kitchen. We did not need to. It was there in every glance, every accidental touch, every moment when our eyes met across a room and held just a heartbeat too long. The house itself seemed to sense the change, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I continued my duties, cleaning and cooking and maintaining the pretense of normality. But now there were other moments, too. Moments when Edward would find excuses to seek me out, to ask my opinion on some matter of household business, to show me a passage in a book he thought I might enjoy. Moments when we would walk in the gardens together, the dogs ranging ahead of us, talking about everything and nothing while the afternoon light slanted golden through the clouds. He told me about his life before Marguerite, about his education at Oxford, his travels through Europe, his brief and unhappy attempt to enter politics. He told me about his parents, both dead now, and the pressure they had put on him to marry well, to continue the line, to be worthy of the name he carried. I told him about my own past, though there was less to tell. The endless houses, the endless service, the endless feeling of being invisible, of being no one. I told him about my mother, who had died when I was 16, leaving me alone in a world that had no use for orphaned maids, with no connections and no prospects. He listened to everything I said with an attention that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. When I spoke, his eyes never left my face. When I laughed, he smiled. When I fell silent, he waited, patient and kind, until I was ready to speak again. This is what it feels like, I realized one afternoon as we walked along the cliff path. The sea crashing below and the wind whipping my hair around my face. This is what it feels like to be cherished. It was a feeling I had never known. A feeling I had not believed I would ever know. And now that I had tasted it, I knew I could never go back to the half-life I had lived before. But with the joy came fear. Fear that this could not last. Fear that I was reaching too high, dreaming too large, that at any moment the spell would break and I would find myself cast out, alone again, with nothing but memories to sustain me. It was Mrs. Blackwood who finally forced the issue. She came to me one evening as I was preparing Edward's supper tray, her face set in lines of disapproval. "I know what is happening between you and his lordship," she said without preamble. "I have seen the way he looks at you, the way you look at him." I kept my eyes on the tray, arranging the dishes with hands that had begun to tremble. "I do not know what you mean. Do not lie to me, girl," she snapped. "I have served this family for 30 years. I have seen things that would turn your hair white, and I am telling you now, for your own good, that nothing can come of this. You are a servant. He is an earl. Society will never accept it. And even if it did, there is still the matter of the Countess." She lowered her voice, leaning closer. "Her spirit has not left this house," she hissed. "I have felt her presence every night since she died. She watches, she waits, and she will not let another woman take her place." I finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "The Countess wanted me to come here," I said quietly. "She sacrificed herself so that I could live. Why would she object to my happiness?" Mrs. Blackwood recoiled as if I had struck her. "How do you know that?" she demanded. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I have read her journals," I answered. "Because I have learned the truth about who I am and why I was brought here. The Countess was my aunt, Mrs. Blackwood. I am the last of the Beaumont line, and whatever happens between Edward and me, it is what she wanted. It is what she died for." The old woman stared at me for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions too quickly for me to read. Then she turned and walked away without another word, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the weight of her silence heavy on my shoulders. That night, I told Edward what had happened. We were in his study, the fire burning low, the shadows dancing on the walls. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each word. "She is not wrong about society," he said when I had finished. "If we were to marry, there would be scandal. There would be talk. Your life would become very difficult." "I know," I said. "And you are willing to accept that?" I looked at him, at this man who had become so dear to me in such a short time, and I felt something settle in my chest, something certain. "I have spent my entire life being judged," I said, "being found wanting, being told that I was not good enough, would never be good enough. And for most of that time, I believed it. I accepted what others said about me because I did not know any better." I rose from my chair and crossed to where he sat, kneeling before him so that our eyes were level. "But you have shown me something different," I continued. "You have shown me that I am worthy of love, that I deserve to be happy, and I am not willing to give that up, not for society, not for scandal, not for anything." Edward reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of my cheekbones. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since the moment those dogs fell at your feet. I knew then that you were something extraordinary, something miraculous, and I have been falling deeper ever since." He kissed me then, gently at first, and then with increasing urgency, and I kissed him back with all the passion I had been holding inside, all the longing and the hope and the desperate, aching need to belong. When we finally broke apart, we were both trembling. "Marry me," he said. "Tomorrow, tonight. I do not care about society or scandal or what anyone will say. I only care about you." I laughed, tears streaming down my face. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I will marry you." And in that moment, in that dark study in that haunted house, I felt something lift from my shoulders. Something that had been there for as long as I could remember. The weight of loneliness. The burden of never quite fitting in. The endless, exhausting effort of being someone I was not. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged, but our joy was not to last. Not yet. The night before our wedding, the woman in white returned. I woke from a dreamless sleep to find her standing at the foot of my bed, her dark hair hanging loose around her pale face, her eyes fixed on mine with an expression I could not read. I was not afraid. I had grown used to her presence over the weeks, had come to understand that she meant me no harm. But there was something different about her tonight, something urgent. "You must come," she said, and her voice was not the ethereal whisper I had expected, but something solid, something real. "There is something you need to see." I rose and followed her through the darkened corridors, up the stairs to the west wing, through the dust and the decay to the nursery, where Edward had first told me the truth about my heritage. But she did not stop there. She continued past the nursery, through a door I had not noticed before, hidden behind a faded tapestry depicting a hunt scene. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, spiraling upward into darkness. I climbed. The room at the top was small and round. The walls lined with shelves that held bottles and jars and bundles of dried herbs. A laboratory of sorts, though not the kind that any doctor would have recognized. This was something older, something that had more to do with the rituals described in Marguerite's journals than with any modern science. And in the center of the room, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the single round window, was a table. On the table lay a box, wooden and ancient, its surface carved with symbols I did not recognize. "Open it," the woman said. I reached out with hands that shook only slightly and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in folds of silk, was a portrait. Small, no larger than my palm, painted with exquisite care. It showed a young woman with dark hair and pale skin and eyes that seemed to look directly into my soul. My eyes, my face, painted years before I was born. Beneath the portrait was a letter, its seal unbroken, its paper yellowed with age. I lifted it and read the name written on the outside. To Eleanor, my darling daughter. My knees buckled. I sank to the floor, clutching the portrait and the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. The woman in white knelt beside me. She no longer looked like a ghost. She looked like what she had always been. A mother, a protector, a woman who had loved me before I even existed. "I could not save myself," she said softly. "The curse was too strong, the darkness too close. But I could save you. I could give you the life I was never allowed to have. I could give you love." She reached out and touched my face, and her fingers were warm, solid, real. "Edward is a good man," she said. "He loved me the best he could, and he will love you better. Be happy, Eleanor. Be happy for both of us." And then she was gone. I remained in that round room until dawn, reading the letter she had left for me. It told me everything. The truth about my birth, about the twin who had been taken from her, about the daughter she had known would someday come to set things right. It told me about the ritual she had performed, the sacrifice she had made, the love that had driven her to the edge of those cliffs and over. And it told me one more thing, one final secret that she had kept until the very end. "Edward does not know," she had written, "but I have left something for you in the tower room, something that will prove once and for all that the curse has been broken. Open the box on your wedding day, and you will understand." I returned to that room on the morning of my wedding, Edward at my side. Together, we opened the second box that sat on the highest shelf, a box I had not noticed in the moonlit darkness of the night before. Inside was a christening gown, white silk trimmed with lace sized for an infant, and beneath it a note in Marguerite's hand. "For your daughter," it said. The first of a new line, unburdened by the curse that claimed so many before her. May she live a long and happy life, and may she always know that she was loved. Edward looked at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She knew," he whispered. "Somehow, she knew." I pressed the christening gown to my heart and felt something warm bloom in my chest. Hope. Pure, unalloyed hope. We were married that afternoon in the small chapel on the grounds of Blackmore Hall. Mrs. Blackwood served as witness. Her disapproval softened somewhat by the revelation of my true identity. The dogs lay at our feet throughout the ceremony, their amber eyes peaceful for the first time since their mistress had died. The chapel was small and ancient, built of the same gray stone as the manor itself, its windows filled with stained glass that cast colored shadows across the worn floor. Generations of Ashworths had been married here, had been christened here, had been mourned here. The weight of their presence filled the air like incense, watching, waiting, bearing witness to this new chapter in the family's history. I wore a gown that had belonged to Edward's mother, ivory silk with seed pearls stitched along the bodice. Mrs. Blackwood had found it in one of the old trunks and had altered it to fit me, her gnarled fingers working the needle with surprising delicacy. When I looked at myself in the mirror before the ceremony, I saw a woman I barely recognized. Not a servant, not an orphan, but a bride. Edward waited for me at the altar, dressed in a dark coat that set off the amber of his eyes. When I walked toward him down the narrow aisle, I saw something in his face that made my heart stop. Wonder, gratitude, and love, so pure and powerful that it seemed to radiate from him like light. He took my hands in his, and his voice was steady as he spoke the ancient vows. "I, Edward, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." I spoke my own vows with tears streaming down my face, not from sadness, but from a joy so overwhelming that my heart could not contain it. This man, this beautiful, broken, wonderful man, had chosen me, had loved me, had seen past the servant's dress and the uncertain past to the woman beneath. When we kissed, I felt something shift in the world around us, a settling, a completion, as if the house itself had been waiting for this moment, holding its breath for 5 long years, and could finally exhale. The dogs began to howl, not the mournful keening I had heard on my first night at Blackmore Hall, but something different. Something that sounded almost like singing. Outside the chapel windows, the clouds parted, and a single shaft of golden light fell across the altar, illuminating us in its warmth. I looked up at the light and thought I saw something there. A face, a figure, the suggestion of dark hair and pale skin and eyes that held nothing but love. Marguerite, she was there. She had come to see us married, to give us her blessing, to witness the fulfillment of everything she had sacrificed for. I felt her presence wrap around me like an embrace, warm and welcoming and utterly at peace. "Be happy," her voice whispered in my mind. "Be happy for both of us." And then she was gone, fading into the light, leaving behind only the warmth of her love and the certainty that she was finally at rest. I looked at Edward, and I saw from his expression that he had felt it too. His eyes were bright with tears, his smile tremulous but real. "She was here," he said softly. "I know," I replied. "She came to say goodbye." We stood there in the golden light, husband and wife, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future. And I knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. And that night, as we lay together in the great bed where generations of Ashworths had slept, I felt Marguerite's presence one last time. A warmth that settled over me like a blessing, a whisper of love that echoed through the years. "Thank you," it seemed to say. "Thank you for coming home." The months that followed were the happiest of my life. Edward and I explored the manor together, uncovering secrets that had been buried for decades. We restored the gardens that had been left to ruin, planting roses and lavender and all the flowers that Marguerite had loved. We opened the West Wing to light and air, transforming it from a mausoleum into a gallery that celebrated the history of both our families. And in the spring, just as the first crocuses were pushing through the thawed earth, I felt the quickening of new life within me. Our daughter was born in the round room at the top of the tower, with the dogs standing guard outside the door and the ghost of her grandmother watching over us with eyes full of love. We named her Marguerite, after the woman who had sacrificed everything so that she could exist. The birth itself was difficult, as births often are, but I was never afraid. I could feel the presence of all the Beaumont women who had come before me, gathered around me like a protective circle, lending me their strength, their courage, their fierce determination to bring this new life into the world. Mrs. Blackwood served as midwife, her gnarled hands surprisingly gentle as she guided me through the long hours of labor. Edward paced outside the door, the dogs whimpering at his feet, forbidden by custom from entering but unable to stay away. When our daughter finally emerged, screaming her protest at being forced from the warm darkness into the cold light of the world, I felt a joy so overwhelming that for a moment I could not breathe. This was what Marguerite had seen. This was what she had painted in that portrait, what she had prayed for, what she had died for. This tiny, perfect creature, with her father's dark hair and her grandmother's pale skin. Edward was permitted to enter then, and I will never forget the look on his face when he saw his daughter for the first time. Wonder, awe, a love so profound that it seemed to transform him from the inside out. "She is beautiful," he whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch her cheek. "She is perfect. She is ours." He sat beside me on the bed, and together we gazed at the miracle we had created. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the moors, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The dogs had stopped their whimpering and were now howling, not with grief, but with joy, welcoming the newest member of their pack. Little Marguerite opened her eyes for the first time, and I gasped. She had my eyes, my mother's eyes, the eyes that see beyond the veil. But there was something different about them, something that set them apart from the tormented gaze I had seen in portraits of the Beaumont women who had come before. My daughter's eyes held no fear, no shadow, no hint of the darkness that had claimed so many of her ancestors. Instead, they held light, pure, clear, undimmed light, as if she were looking at a world that was full of beauty and promise, a world where the curse had no power, where the sight was a gift instead of a burden. "The curse is truly broken," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "She is free. She will live." Edward gathered us both in his arms and held us close. "We all will," he said, together. She had her father's dark hair and her grandmother's pale skin, but her eyes, when she opened them for the first time and looked up at me with that unfocused newborn gaze, were my eyes, my mother's eyes, the eyes that see beyond the veil. I held her close and whispered a promise into the soft shell of her ear. "You will never be alone," I told her. "You will never be unloved. You will never have to wonder where you belong, because you belong here, with us, in this house that your grandmother built with her dreams and her sacrifice and her unshakable belief that love is stronger than death." The dogs came to meet her that evening, pressing their great heads against the blankets that swaddled her, whimpering softly as if in recognition. The largest of them, The one with the scarred muzzle laid his chin on the edge of her cradle and looked at her with those amber eyes that held so much wisdom, so much memory. "Welcome home, little one," his gaze seemed to say. "We have been waiting for you for a very long time." Edward stood behind me, his arms wrapped around us both, his chin resting on the top of my head. "She is beautiful," he murmured. "She is perfect." "She is the beginning," I said. "The beginning of something new." And as the sun set over Blackmore Hall, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I felt the last vestiges of the old curse fade away. The darkness that had haunted the Beaumont women for generations was gone, banished by love and sacrifice and the unbreakable bonds of family. There were still mysteries to unravel in the months that followed, still secrets buried in the old walls of Blackmore Hall that revealed themselves slowly, like flowers opening to the sun. One such mystery concerned the scar on the largest dog's muzzle, the one I had noticed on my very first day. Edward told me the story one evening as we sat in the library, the fire crackling low, the dogs drowsing at our feet. "He got that scar protecting Marguerite," Edward said, his voice soft with memory. "It was 3 years into our marriage, before the worst of her illness took hold. There was a man, a doctor from London, who had heard about her condition and wanted to study her. He came to the house uninvited, demanding to examine her. When she refused, he tried to force his way into her rooms." Edward's jaw tightened. The dog, Magnus, she called him, threw himself between them. The doctor had a cane with a metal tip. He struck Magnus across the face, splitting the skin to the bone. But Magnus did not back down. He drove the doctor from the house, and the man never returned. I looked at Magnus, sleeping peacefully by the fire, and felt a rush of gratitude for his loyalty. "She loved these dogs more than anything," Edward continued. "More than me, sometimes, I think. They understood her in a way that I never could. When she was lost in her visions, when she could not tell what was real and what was shadow, they would stay with her, pressing against her, keeping her grounded. They were her tethers to this world. And when she died, they lost their purpose," I said softly. Edward nodded. "They became what they were meant to be, protectors, guardians. But without her to protect, without her to guard, that instinct turned dark. They attacked anyone who came near because they were still looking for her, still hoping she would return. And then I came," I said. "And then you came?" He agreed. "And they knew. Somehow, they knew that you were what they had been waiting for all along." I reached down and ran my fingers through Magnus's thick fur. He stirred in his sleep, his tail thumping once against the floor, and then he settled again, peaceful, content. The second mystery was darker, and it took longer to uncover. It began with the discovery of a hidden room in the cellars, a space that had been bricked up decades ago and forgotten. We found it while searching for the source of a persistent draft, and what we found inside turned my blood to ice. The room had been a study of sorts, filled with books and papers that bore the name of Edward's grandfather, the 3rd Earl of Ashworth. Among the papers were records of payments, meticulous and damning, to a family in France, the Beaumont family. Edward read the documents with a face that grew paler with each page. "My grandfather knew," he said finally, his voice hollow. "He knew about Marguerite's family, about the gift that ran in their blood. He arranged the marriage deliberately. He thought that if he could breed that gift into the Ashworth line, it would give his descendants an advantage. Power, influence, the ability to see what others could not." I felt sick. "He used her," I said. "He used her like a broodmare." "He used us all," Edward said bitterly. "Marguerite, me, even you. This entire tragedy was engineered generations ago by a man who cared more about power than people." "But the curse," I said. Surely he did not anticipate the curse. Edward looked at me with eyes that held an ancient weariness. Perhaps he did not care. Perhaps he thought the power was worth any price. Or perhaps, he added slowly, the curse was his punishment, the price he paid for his ambition. We burned those papers that night, watching them curl and blacken in the fire. Whatever sins had been committed in the name of the Ashworth legacy, they ended here. With us, our daughter would inherit nothing but love. The third mystery was the most personal, and it came to me not through documents or hidden rooms, but through my own blood. It happened on a night when the moon was full, and the wind howled around the eaves like a living thing. I woke from a dream of cliffs and sea, and a woman falling, and I found myself standing at the window of our bedroom, staring out at the darkness. And I could see things, not ghosts, not exactly, but shapes in the darkness, figures that moved at the edges of my vision, presences that seemed to hover just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. I watched them with a strange calm, understanding instinctively what they were. The dead. The Beaumont women who had come before me, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, all the way back through the generations to the first woman who had opened her eyes to the world beyond and paid the ultimate price. They were not there to frighten me. They were there to welcome me, to acknowledge that I was one of them, that the gift had passed to me, that the sight that had blessed and cursed our line for centuries now lived in my blood as surely as it had lived in theirs. But there was something different about what I saw, something that set my visions apart from the tormented glimpses that had driven Marguerite to madness. I could control it. I realized this slowly, over weeks and months of practice. The gift was there, the ability to perceive what lay beyond the veil, but it no longer controlled me. I could choose when to look and when to turn away. I could walk the boundary between worlds without losing myself in the darkness on the other side. The curse, it seemed, truly had been broken. Marguerite's sacrifice had not only freed me from early death, but had transformed the gift itself, turning it from a burden into a tool. I could see without being consumed. I could know without being destroyed. I told Edward about this gradually, watching his face for signs of fear or revulsion. But he only held me closer, his arms strong around me, his voice steady in my ear. "Whatever you are," he said, "whatever gifts you carry, you are still the woman I love. You are still my wife, and nothing will ever change that." His acceptance meant more to me than I could express. To be known fully, to be seen for everything I was, and to be loved not despite it, but because of it, this was a gift greater than any supernatural sight. I thought of all the roads that had led me here, the hardship and the loneliness, the years of service and struggle. The night I had stood at those iron gates, certain that I was walking to my death, only to find my salvation in the eyes of 3 monstrous dogs who had fallen at my feet and wept. "Blood knows blood," Marguerite had written, and she had been right. From the moment I stepped onto the grounds of Blackmore Hall, I had been coming home. I had been returning to a place that had been waiting for me, to a family that had loved me before I was born, to a destiny that had been written in the stars long before I took my first breath. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know what challenges my daughter will face, what gifts or burdens she will carry, what paths her life will take. But I know that she will never walk those paths alone. She will have her father's strength and her grandmother's courage, and the fierce, protective love of 3 black dogs who will guard her until their last breath. And she will have me, her mother, her protector, the woman who found her way home through fog and fear and the impossible loyalty of creatures who recognized in her blood something that transcended death itself. They told me the dogs would kill me before I reached the front door. They were wrong. Those dogs were not guardians of the grave. They were guardians of the future. They were waiting all those years for the one who would set them free, for the one who would set us all free. And now, as I write these words by candlelight while my daughter sleeps and my husband reads by the fire and the dogs dream their ancient dreams before the hearth, I understand at last what Marguerite meant when she wrote those final words in her journal. Love is the only thing that matters. Love is the only thing that lasts. Everything else, the titles and the scandals and the whispers of society, will fade with time. But love endures. Love persists. Love finds a way. It found its way to me, against all odds, in a haunted house on a lonely moor. And it will find its way to you too, dear reader, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever darkness surrounds you. Just open your heart and let it in. The dogs knew. They always knew. And now, so do I.